Welcome to episode 190 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show the public who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Well, today we get to speak to retired agent and former FBI Deputy Director John Pistole. John served in the FBI for 26 years, climbing through the ranks to attain the second highest position in the Bureau. In this episode, John reviews the time early in his career that he worked in the New York FBI office on an organized crime task force investigating illegal mob ties to the Teamsters Union. During his career, John Pistole was assigned to the Minneapolis, New York, Indianapolis, and Boston divisions and FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, he was placed in charge of the FBI's counterterrorism program, eventually becoming the FBI's Executive Assistant Director for National Security. During his last 6 years with the Bureau, John worked closely with FBI Director Robert Mueller as his deputy director to help transform the FBI into a proactive national security agency with law enforcement and intelligence community authorities and responsibilities. While he was serving as FBI Deputy Director, President Obama nominated John as the administrator of the Transportation Security Administration, TSA. John served as administrator for 4.5 years. Currently, he is president of his alma mater, Anderson University in Indiana. Before we get to the interview, I have to say, Merry Christmas. For those of you who don't celebrate Christmas, happy holidays. This has been a fascinating year for me. As a matter of fact, on December 29th or December 30th, this Sunday or Monday, FBI Retired Case File Review will surpass 3 million downloads. I predicted that it would happen before the end of the year, and it looks like it definitely will. I want to thank you so much for being a loyal listener. When I started this podcast, I had no idea where it would take me. In January, I'll be starting my 5th year as the host and producer of FBI Retired Case File Review. Wow. And thank you so much for sticking with me as I changed the format to releasing every other week. Don't forget that I have that holiday gift for you. The FBI search word puzzle is now posted on my website, jerrywilliams.com. Over the holiday break, it might be fun to print out a few copies and have a race to see who could find all the words first. I also want to let you know that I did make that trip to the FBI Academy. I'm going to write up a long post with lots of photos for my January reader team email. If you're not yet a member of my reader team, I'd like to invite you to join. Once a month, I send out my email digest and try to keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. There's a link to join my reader team in your podcast app's description of this episode. If you've already picked up a copy of FBI Myths and Misconceptions, thank you. Please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. I want to thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, John Pistole. John, how are you?
Jerry, I'm doing fine today. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. And I must ask you, is it okay if I call you John?
It sure is. That is my name. So I've had some titles in my career, but yeah, my name has always remained John. So
well, thank you, because if we were in the FBI still today, I would be too starstruck to actually come up to you and shake your hand and call you John. It definitely would have been boss, or it would have been, deputy director. But I want to make sure that everyone listening understands exactly who I'm talking to. So as the former deputy director of the FBI, every FBI employee at the time reported to you. You were, in turn, the only direct report of the director, who at the time was Director Robert Mueller, which I'm sure many people know that name too.
Special counsel, yes.
Yeah. So unless I can convince Louis Freeh, who is the only director of the FBI who was an FBI agent, unless I can convince him to come on the show, and I can tell you, I've asked. So far, the answer has been no. But unless I can convince him to come on the show, then you are the highest person that I will, from the FBI, that I will have on the show.
Well, I wish you the best on that with getting Louis on.
I reached out to you after I heard from Narissa, who was in your new agent class.
That's right. Narissa Palafian. Yeah, we stood next to each other, sat next to each other, and new agents class 8318 back a few years ago. So, yes.
Yeah, a few years ago.
Yes, she's a great agent.
She suggested that I reach out to you, and I was like, okay. And I was just so pleased that you immediately said yes. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. I just done another podcast that I think you're familiar with, the Oath with Chuck Rosenberg. So it just seemed like a good time to continue on with a fellow retired FBI agent. So glad to do it, Jerry.
Yeah. And that particular podcast episode, again, on the Oath with Chuck Rosenberg, was fantastic. It really gave me a full overview of your amazing career. But what I thought we would do today is to drill down a bit, because this, of course, is FBI retired case file review. And what I like to do is to go into a particular case, to really look at FBI procedures, what it's like as an FBI agent to work a case. And I thought for you that we would talk about the time when you were in New York working organized crime.
Right. Well, be glad to do that. It was a second office for me. So my first office out of Quantico was Minneapolis. And I spent 3 beautiful winters there, about 2.5 years. Got there in January of '84, and the land of the frozen chosen, and just some great work there. And then after 2 years, received my transfer letter to New York City. And I thought, boy, Minneapolis and New York City. Somebody in the transfer unit has really got it out for me here on this northern assignments, and then, of course, a high cost of living. And unfortunately, back at that time, my transfer was October of '85. There was no cost differential, cost of living differential for agents in New York City, Manhattan, where I was assigned, versus Indianapolis, where I processed through, or Minneapolis, or any low cost area. And there was no accelerated grade or anything like that. So I came in as a GS, just received an 11, but was making about $29,000 a year. And the realtor who was helping my wife and me find a home couldn't believe that that's all we were making. She said, they can't pay you that and send you to New York City. And so I said, well, they did, and then here we are. So let's see what we can do about it. But it turned out to be a great assignment, work with great people. So,
well, I know that you're from Indiana, and so that had to be a big culture shift. Going from small town Indiana and Minneapolis, and then New York City.
Yeah, it was a huge culture change. I'd been fortunate to travel a fair amount up until that time, but of course I'd never lived in a major metropolitan area, and of course couldn't afford Manhattan. So lived in New Jersey and commuted in through the Holland Tunnel every day, as thousands of FBI employees have done over the years. One of my colleagues, also from New Agents class, along with Narissa, was an agent named Earl Pitts, and Earl was an attorney.
Yeah, I know the name Earl Pitts.
You've heard that name. So he got transferred to New York City the same time I did, again, without any cost differential. And he was so upset that the Bureau wasn't paying anything different that he ended up buying, I think it was like 60 miles out north of New York City, and eventually used that as the justification for selling FBI secrets to then the Soviets. Still, the Soviet Empire was still around in the 80s, mid 80s. And so that was his reason for doing that. And he was working for counterintelligence, as it was called at the time. So, yeah, a lot of, as they say, 1,000 agents, 1,000 stories in New York City.
Well, again, as you said, it was his justification, but we know that cost of living is no excuse to be a traitor to your country.
No, for sure. Yeah.
Well, that's a case I'll have to find out if I can get somebody involved in that case to talk about on the show. I've actually talked to Mike Rochford, who talked about Robert Hansen.
Right.
I've talked to a case agent involved with what's the other guy's name from the CIA?
Aldrich Ames.
Yeah, on the Aldrich Ames case. Done a number. I've done John Walker also. Definitely need to do Pitts too. But getting back to you.
Yes.
And I talked about the culture change, moving from a small town to New York. It also had to be a culture change investigating organized crime. And so one of the first questions that I need to ask you about is, how did you get on that squad? Because I understand second office agents, you're still, pretty new. To be able to get on that type of a squad had to be,
I was very fortunate, Jerry, and it's because I had a great supervisor in Minneapolis who had mentored other first office agents who had gone on to New York and on to headquarters and things. And so, as you know, your reputation precedes you. And so going from Quantico to Minneapolis, I had done well at Quantico, maxed out the physical fitness test, and had, obviously got through the academics and firearms and all that. And so I think I had a decent reputation and did good work in Minneapolis. So my supervisor, Doug Solberg, had talked to a friend of his who was in New York as a supervisor and put in a good word. And I don't know exactly how it happened, but I was so pleased when I got there to 26 Federal Plaza in Lower Manhattan and reported to the assistant director's office, not to see him, of course, but the assistant, to say, okay, you're assigned to Squad C5, which is an organized crime squad. I'd had a heads up that would probably be it. But there was another new agent coming in, or another second office agent arriving at the same time, and I knew of her. We were in the same class, but she was very competent and capable. And we were both told at the same time, and she was going to a foreign counterintelligence squad, which was not deemed as attractive or as satisfying, if you will, as an organized crime squad. And she was pretty upset because she thought that she would be going to an OC squad. So the New York division had 9 different organized crime squads, primarily focused on traditional LCN, La Cosa Nostra, the 5 Italian families, and then the other 19 LCN families around the country at that time. There was also an Asian organized crime squad, and then a kind of a hybrid Eastern European, like Albanian and other organized crime. So it was quite a cadre of both agents and investigators. And so my squad that I was assigned to was a joint organized crime task force. So there were, I think, 11 agents, mostly young, like myself. And our supervisor was quite young, in his early to mid 30s. And first office had only been in New York City. He was from New York. But then we also had 10 to 12 NYPD detectives and a sergeant and lieutenant assigned. And so the beauty of it was to take the expertise of the NYPD cops, detectives who had been around a while and earned the opportunity to be assigned to a federal task force and get federal overtime and other things, other benefits they may not get simply on their NYPD assignment. So we got the benefit of their street expertise, knowledge, and obviously having been born and raised, most of them, in one of the 5 boroughs, then coupled with the FBI expertise in terms of using the RICO statute, the Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organization statute. So that melding of streetwise smarts along with the FBI policies and procedures, and then the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York in Manhattan, which was basically across the street from 26 Federal Plaza. And then across the river, literally 2 miles from the office, was the second U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York, which was from Brooklyn. So separate U.S. Attorney's offices, which had some of the best, if not the best, federal prosecutors in the country aggressively competing, if you will, for FBI cases. And so what a blessing that was to be in, one, a target-rich environment, meaning there are a lot of mob guys out doing a lot of stuff. So we almost had our pick based on what squad we were assigned to, and it's divided up by LCN family. So I was first assigned to the Colombo family, that is focused on, obviously, the Colombo family. And then later, the Genovese family. And so there would be prosecutors, AUSAs, assistant U.S. attorneys, in both the Southern District and the Eastern District, who would try to establish venue and jurisdiction within their district so they could bring a case, charge people, mob guys in their district. So it was a great setup for FBI agents who were trying to make cases and lock up some bad guys who were part of traditional organized crime.
Well, when you talk about, so I came from the investigations involving economic crime. And so usually I was the case agent. I worked the case alone. I had 1 or 2 subjects and that was it. So could you explain to everybody how an organized crime squad would work when the entire squad is going after an organized crime family? I mean,
Sure.
Who gets assigned what?
Yeah, so it would depend on which squad and which family. The Genovese at the time was the largest family, most powerful, most members, and things like that. But when I first started, as I said, it was on the Colombo family. And the supervisor, the first supervisor I had, would assign some individual cases, for example, against 1 or 2 mob guys who reported to the same capo, which is like a lieutenant in the family. But then he also decided to sign a major case and applied for and got major case status on investigation into what was called Joint Council 16 of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. So there was source information that alleged, with some pretty good credibility, that the Teamsters Joint Council, which comprised about 73 different Teamsters local unions at that time in the greater New York City area, all reported to this, again, called a Joint Council, which was also headquartered in Manhattan, that it was controlled by the Colombo, La Cosa Nostra family, and maybe some others, but the Colombos really exercised racketeering influence illegally over the Teamsters Union through a number of different means. And so I was, after I'd been there a year or so and had some fortunate good success on some individual cases, my supervisor assigned me as a co-case agent on this Joint Council 16 La Cosa Nostra investigation of mob control of the Teamsters.
What does that mean to the average person? Why is it illegal that the Teamsters are controlled by an organized crime family? I mean, what does that mean to the everyday person?
Well, so if you're a Teamster member, for example, you're a truck driver. So 2 of the locals that we particularly focused on involved delivery truck drivers. And the mob would, if they controlled a local union, would put a mob guy on the payroll as a no-show employee. So the union, because they've been corrupted, and number of different possibilities there how that would have happened, but they might be paying a mob guy $100,000 a year, but who was doing no work. And when we investigated that, and I remember interviewing one of the the mob guys that we were looking at charging and asked him about this job and said, yeah, this looks like a no-show. He said, oh, no, my job is to drive around New York City, and I'm a spotter looking for particular trucking company trucks out on the highways and streets, and to see if they're one of our local guys who are driving, and to basically do unannounced checks of whether they're doing the right thing. So in other words, it was a license to steal, because he could be out driving anywhere doing mob business, collecting loan sharking money, which is money loaned at usurious interest rates, so illegally high interest rates from gambling, people with gambling debts, or extortion for protection money, for example, from a restaurant that I won't break your windows in your restaurant in Midtown Manhattan if you pay me protection money, and things like that. So he could be doing all the mob business, and then of course all the numbers, the gambling, which was still a huge profit center for the mob back in the 80s. So that no-show job was simply additional income that was at the detriment to the union members who were paying union dues and yet not receiving anything of value for their union participation. And so there's a lot more to it, but that would be it in a high level nutshell, if you will.
And on the other side, why would a Teamster official agree to pay a mob family this no-show job?
Yeah, it could be for several reasons. One, it could be that the union official was getting a kickback of that. So instead of $100,000 going to the mob guy, maybe they bump it up to 120, but the union official keeps 20 of it, and the mob guy gets 20. Could be the union official has a gambling addiction, gambling problem, and so is in debt to the mob, or could even be a drug problem, drug habit or something like that. And so the mob helps them out, if you will, by paying off a debt or something like that. And then, of course, they've got their hooks into them. And so this no-show job is just one way of paying that off. Of course, the macro picture, going back even further, for your listeners who are interested in the history of Las Vegas, have probably heard and known that it was largely Teamsters money extorted and stolen by the mob that helped build Las Vegas back in the day. So there's there's been lots. I think there's even a show out right now about that on Netflix or something in terms of mob control of the Teamsters Union. So that's exactly what we were investigating. And we had anywhere from 5 to 8 agents assigned to it, to this major case, along with 4 to 6 or 7 detectives full time every day. So it was a terrific opportunity for us to identify who we believed in the mob and then in the union were in collusion, and how we would go about trying to bring a racketeering enterprise corrupt organization, or RICO, investigation to the U.S. Attorney's Office for prosecution, focusing on both the locals, the local unions and the mob engagement there, and then on this umbrella organization referred to as Joint Council 16.
And how would you do that? On a day-to-day, what does your investigation involve? I mean, you can't be walking straight up to, a mob guy and saying, "What are you doing wrong?"
I suppose you could, but
it might not work.
You probably get a pretty terse answer there. So, so as in any FBI investigation, you're trying to develop sources of information that would be beneficial to just understanding the scope of the challenge. So, for example, just working with the Department of Labor and looking at, so what is the organizational construct for these dozens of Teamsters locals, and how does that fit into the Joint Council? And then what's that organizational construct, and who are the officers? And believe it or not, on the Joint Council, there were, as I recall, there were 2 officers listed on their Department of Labor information sheets that we believed were either made mob guys or mob associates. And so there was not a whole lot of attempt to conceal that there was something. Now, they said they're, of course, legitimate businessmen and all that. So we start with that and then see if in the FBI databases of confidential informants and cooperating witnesses, not only in New York, but any place around the country, was there anybody who reported on one of these Teamsters locals or the Joint Council or the Teamsters International, of course, because presumably there was some corruption there that might tie into the New York investigation. And then we would also do physical surveillance, and that's where the NYPD cops were so effective. One of the great benefits of the NYPD detectives is, of course, being from there, having worked there, they knew the city, the 5 boroughs and everything like the back of their hand. And so we would ask them to do physical surveillance, meaning getting in a car and following, for example, the president of the certain key local unions or even the officers of the Joint Council 16, the regional entity for the Teamsters, simply to follow them and see, are they going to work? Is it a no-show job? Do they ever go to the union hall or the union offices? Who are they meeting with for lunch? Is it a mob guy? Well, that might actually happen. Or are they meeting with a city council member or perhaps another politician? Just trying to figure out who's within their sphere of influence, if you will. And
Are these covert surveillances or
yes.
are they okay? Because I know like sometimes in counterintelligence work, you know, your subject is fully aware that they're being watched and
you bumper lock them, right? You just get on their bumper and
right.
No, these would be all, unless we had a particular reason. And for example, we call it tickle the wire. In case we had a wiretap going and we wanted to see what they would talk about. So we'd make our surveillance obvious to generate conversation on the phone or in the office that we had bugged to say, you know, what are they concerned about? So hopefully, you know, the feds didn't see me doing this or that or something like that. But no, almost always it'd be a covert surveillance. And it may be for a day, might be for a week or something. Might be from the time they leave their house in the morning till the time they go to bed that night. So it was very resource intensive in terms of not only NYPD, but there's also special operations teams for the FBI that would help out on that on priority cases. So we would do the physical surveillance. We'd talk to the informants and cooperating witnesses. We would work with the Department of Labor to get all the background information that they had on the unions because they have reporting requirements, and to see who the officers were. And then for the Joint Council, also the regional body for the Teamsters, and get all that information just to see who we're dealing with. And then see what we could pick up from any information from around the country about any of those individuals. And then we would try to target several of them for further investigation, primarily looking at, so what is this Teamsters officials' ties to the Colombo family or perhaps one of the other crime families? And what is the mob members' interest? And sometimes there were relatives. I mean, blood relatives. One was a mob guy and his cousin was a union official. And so just trying to explore those in a way that we could bring a criminal investigation to the forefront of eventually having the U.S. Attorney's Office charge somebody.
I know that you had mentioned that this is a joint task force and you're also working, you know, with the NYPD detectives. Mm-hmm. Are there any other agencies? As I know in Philly, and I'm pretty aware of Philly's organized crime squads, you know, they also have people from the state and say from labor. Are there any of those people also on your squad?
So not assigned to the task force full time. So it was just FBI and NYPD as far as the task force, but we would work with many other agencies, including, again, Department of Labor, for example, and then IRS, Criminal Investigative Division, IRS CID. There'd be, as you mentioned, some state and city regulatory agencies for the unions that we would deal with because they had information that filings, and most of those filings, clearly with the federal government, it would be a federal offense to submit false documents false information on the documents, similar to filing a false tax return. So we would we would ask all those agencies and trying to get what we describe as a rich picture of who we were dealing with. And then we would have a war room, if you will, meaning a secure small conference room where we could go and just put on the board all the connections. So basically a diagram. So here's the boss of the Colombo family. Here's the underboss. Here are the capos, the lieutenants. Here's the soldiers, and here's the associates. And then on another board, here's all the Teamster officials, all the way down from the president of the Joint Council to the president of the locals and all their representatives. And then basically do a link analysis to say, what are the connections we have? Because we've also subpoenaed their phone records. For example, at one time, we had what's called a pen register, which would track the calls in terms of the numbers dialed and answered and for how long. It was not a wiretap, so we didn't have any content on who was talking. But we actually had, I remember at one time, 15 pen registers up on this investigation, which was a huge amount of data coming in every day that we would have to analyze and then, again, do a link analysis going back to that war room to say, okay, who in the mob contacted who in the Teamsters yesterday, and what's that connection? And that might be then the basis or the predication, if you will, for doing a physical surveillance and then a query of all the FBI and NYPD source databases of people who had reported on any of those individuals. So very resource intensive, but fortunately, there were people who had been jammed up on a drug or some other type of charge who would be willing to cooperate in exchange for a more lenient sentence. And so we had these cooperators who would provide, again, some of that rich picture of, okay, here's the context for why Joe Triatola, who was the head of the Joint Council, might be calling Nicky Black Grancio, who is at the time, a Colombo soldier, going to become a capo before he was later murdered in a Colombo family war. But here's why they might be talking. And so that would be part of our predication then to seek a wiretap, either on the phone where these two individuals had talked, or if we could get somebody into a meeting in an office or perhaps even a restaurant where they hold court, as mob guys would do, perhaps in a certain area of a restaurant where we could actually install our technical agents would go in and install a microphone or do it on an office line or a home line if we had probable cause to believe that criminal conversations were taking place over those lines.
Who were the actual targets of this particular investigation that we're talking about?
So it was both the members of the Colombo LCN family, La Cosa Nostra family, and then also members of the Teamsters leadership who might have been corrupted either by or in concert with the mob to further their own, their personal wealth or power, whatever it might be. So it was both individuals in the mob and in the union. And then we looked at people who had been extorted or victimized, threatened, or whomever as potential witnesses who might come forward, or if not, would at least provide us information confidentially that we could use in a wiretap affidavit that we would take to a federal district court judge to get information or to get a court order that would allow us to do one of those wiretaps. So we were equal opportunity investigators, as we like to say.
Yeah, that's nice. I know that these can be long-term investigations that, again, you talked about a number of resources that you've used. And I have to, I have to acknowledge that a lot of the tools that you use for organized crime, people might be surprised, are the same tools that I use for when I worked white collar crime.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. I supervised a white collar crime squad in Indianapolis for 5+ years. And yeah, we had virtually the same tools available to us. Didn't use them nearly as much in that instance as in that target rich environment in New York City. But yeah, all the investigative tools are available as long as there's a statutory basis for using them for that particular violation. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
And so what were the results of this particular investigation?
So it did go on, parts of it for 18 months. The full investigation went slightly over 2 years. So we were able to identify and indict and convict several members of the Colombo LCN family for their racketeer influence over the Teamsters, certain unions. There were 2 unions in particular, both in Queens, that we were able to identify corrupt officials in those 2 unions. We were never able to prove that the Joint Council, this organizing entity, exercised, or the mob exercised criminal influence over them, or that they had criminal influence over the local unions. So we never made that part of it. But 2 unions, 2 of the local unions, we did indict and convict basically the leadership of both of those. And then at that time, there was an initiative in terms of a civil RICO, so not the criminal charges, but civil RICO aspects dealing with a receivership, basically, for the Teamsters Union, because there was an effort to demonstrate that the entire Teamsters organization was a corrupt organization and should come under a receivership. And so the 2 corrupt unions eventually formed part of the basis of the justification for the Department of Justice seeking and obtaining that type of receivership over the Teamsters, and where there was very close control of the oversight, I should say, of the finances and the bookkeeping and all those things. So yeah, it was a very challenging, long-term, but very satisfying. Unfortunately, there were several people murdered during that time that formed the basis of our RICO indictment. One was a union mechanic in one of the 2 unions that we were focused on, and one of the mob associates was trying to make his bones, as they say, so he could become a made member of the mob, go through the mob induction ceremony like people have probably seen in movies and stuff like that. And one of the ways you do that is by killing somebody. And so this guy, I won't say his name, but confronted this union worker, this mechanic, at his at the shop where he worked, and was trying to get him to back off. He was filing complaints against the union hierarchy, which was mob controlled. It's just causing more attention on that local union than they wanted. And so the mob guy pulled out a gun and shot and killed him there, and basically the locker room where at this mechanics area. And so that was one of our predicate acts. So in a RICO case, you have to have multiple acts of racketeering, and that was one of the predicate acts for this. We refer to him as this stubborn German guy who got whacked, got killed because of his stubbornness and his refusal to back down.
Wow. I know you had mentioned a show on Netflix, and I think were you referring to The Irishman?
Yes. I wasn't sure whether to do a promotional for that or not. So.
I spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about TV shows and movies and books that portray FBI plots and characters and cases and what they get right or what they get wrong. I haven't had a chance to watch The Irishman yet. Have you?
I've seen the first part of it. It's almost 3.5 hours, so it's longer. Yeah. So I saw the first part, and I think there's some embellishments, shocking from what I know. But I'll reserve judgment until I finish watching the whole thing, maybe this weekend. So,
right, but definitely The Irishman. That is about exactly what we're talking about today: organized crime and the relationship with the Teamsters.
Right.
So I'm actually saving it because I am going after an interview with a retired agent who actually handled Frank Sheeran.
That'd be great.
Yeah. And so I'm hoping, he says yes. So now I just have to, get him, to sit down and record the interview. But I really would be so interested in hearing what
Mhm.
he has to say after he's had a chance to watch the
Right.
film and to talk about, his actual knowledge of the case. I think that's going to be interesting, but
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that
Mhm.
you're thinking, of course it's a movie, and so they're going to take some creative
Yeah.
leaps,
Right.
but for the most part, did it seem familiar to?
Oh yeah, and the one thing I can say is accurate about it. I know that Jimmy Hoffa is still missing. So yeah, I think they get that part right. It's been what 20, 30, 25, 45 years. I think that he's been missing. So it's been a while. So yeah, I think he's going to remain missing.
He's going to remain missing. And
Yes.
this, and for those who don't know, this Frank Sharon
Mhm.
claims to have been the person who killed Hoffa
Mhm.
and that his body was cremated.
Mhm.
I'm kind of going for that one too, that cremated theory too.
Well, it's plausible and it's hard to rebut unless you find a body someplace. And as your listeners know, there's been allegations that Hoffa's body was buried in the end zone at the old Giant Stadium in New Jersey and several other places. But yeah, it's never been found. So yeah, still missing.
But it has to be kind of surreal to be watching a movie that depicts, something that you've done as a career. Not the particular case, but,
Right.
That you've worked that type. And I know there was another really famous mob figure that you also had contact with. And I know his name is Vincent. The last name I can't pronounce.
Gigante. Yeah.
All right.
Some people might say Gigante, but yeah. His nickname was the Chin, because he was a boxer as a young guy. He could take it on the chin and keep boxing. But yeah, he was actually the boss of the Genovese family. So after the assignment on the Colombo squad, they did some realignment and we took responsibility for the Genovese squad. And there was a group of agents and detectives in the Brooklyn, Queens resident agency for the FBI that had been investigating the Genovese family from Brooklyn, Queens perspective on some labor racketeering again, some contracts with the Laborers International Union of North America, LIUNA, L-I-U-N-A. And they eventually got an indictment against the Chin, as he's referred to, for some labor racketeering, some extortion, some money laundering, I believe, in different things. And so they had determined that he was actually spending most of his time in Manhattan. And so the FBI management decided to have our squad in Manhattan, C5, actually execute the arrest of Chin Gigante. And so I got to lead that arrest team. And we had helped out on some surveillances and things. He stayed at his mother's place just south of Greenwich Village in New York City. And we would help out on surveillances and things. And it was interesting because this was a guy who, you mentioned famous, I would probably say more infamous, but he kept a very low profile. In fact, many people, outside observers, thought that another individual, Fat Tony Salerno, who had a social club at 116th and First Avenue in Manhattan, or was the boss, because that's what they conveyed in terms of a public persona. And he kind of acted and held himself out as a mob boss. But what we determined through the investigation working with the Brooklyn Queens squad was that Chin Gigante was actually the boss behind the scenes, but he was so concerned about getting arrested and conviction that he feigned insanity. So he actually checked himself into a psychiatric hospital for 2 weeks every year. And he did that for 20 years before he was indicted and we arrested him, and was planning to use that as a basis for an insanity defense. So, for example, before we arrested him, in weeks and even months prior to that, if he thought that we were watching him, he would wander around in a purple bathrobe, the streets of New York City, Greenwich Village, just south of New York University, Washington Square Park. A lot of college kids and tourists and everything. And he'd be wandering around. He'd have this little chapeau cap on. And if he thought that we were watching him, he would literally, one time, went out in the middle of the street and started urinating in the middle of the day. And so that was part of his insanity defense, if you will, that he was not sane. Well, fortunately, we were able to do some covert surveillance, showing him at another location in Midtown Manhattan, where he and his common law wife or girlfriend we would see them at a kitchen table in this apartment, counting out tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then writing things down, so keeping a ledger. So he looked very much competent, as opposed to being insane or something. So yeah, I led the arrest team, got to spend the better part of 12 hours with him. And I was glad I wasn't called to testify as to his state of mind, because but for literally a few seconds, I would have said from a layperson's perspective that the guy was crazy. I mean,
what was he saying or doing that would make you think that?
Well, that he was just muttering things to himself. He was disheveled. He'd ask him a question and he was not responsive. Now, part of it was he wasn't on his meds that morning. We arrested him like 7 o'clock in the morning, and we weren't able to get his prescription bottles out of a locked medicine cabinet. And so that might have been part of it. But literally, we told him he could make a phone call. So he wanted to talk to his brother, who was a priest in the Bronx. And that was a colorful conversation. I'll just say that that priest used a lot of colorful language that I don't think is in the Bible. So about how it was so unjust that we were arresting his brother because he was a sick man and all this kind of stuff. And so in spending that day with him, the processing the fingerprint, the photograph, and then just trying to get some statements against interest from him before his attorney arrived. He just seemed like he was not altogether there.
Was that part of the elaborate ruse?
I think so. And again, I'm glad I wasn't called to testify, because it didn't seem like a ruse to me. It seemed like he was not fully competent. And later on, when the government psychiatrist interviewed him, they said that, no, we think this guy might not be competent to stand trial. And we're saying, well, wait a minute, you're on our side. You're supposed to say that he is competent. And so it actually took 7.5 years.
Wow.
Before he was deemed competent to stand trial, and then to stand trial and then be convicted. And then he was sentenced to prison and eventually died in prison years later. So yeah, it was interesting saga. And so because he was such an intriguing figure, there were a number of photographers there when we did the perp walk, when you walk a perpetrator out of a FBI office and ordered over to the U.S. Attorney's office. So I was on one side of him, another agent was on the other side of him as we walked him out, handcuffed, of course. And so I ended up being on the front page of the New York papers, and then Time Magazine, Newsweek, and all this. And instead of the Godfather, they referred to him as the Odd Father because he was a little bit odd. So yeah, it's just fascinating work that I could have never dreamed about being a practicing lawyer in Indiana, which I did before joining the FBI. So yeah, fascinating work.
Well, you have to send me that photo. Do you have a copy of it?
It's probably online someplace. If you Google his name, Vincent Gigante, and it might be. I haven't done that, but
well, I tell you what, I'll look for it.
Okay.
And I also have a subscription to Newspaper Archive, so I should be able to find it.
It's out there, I'm sure.
Okay, I'm going to look for it.
Okay.
Well, yeah, this has been fascinating because, as I had mentioned, I really haven't spoken to anybody who can tell me a lot about New York organized crime. So I really need to get, well, I did do an interview with, Joe Pistone.
I was going to say you should talk to Joe Pistole.
Oh yeah, no,
exactly.
I did.
Good.
I did do an interview with him. Yeah.
Okay.
But we spent a lot of time really talking about, undercover and what it is to be, to go undercover. So we didn't really go into
Brasco.
Yeah. And we did talk about the movie.
The book and the movie.
Yeah, the book and the movie on that episode. And talking about a book and a movie, I mean, this Vincent Chin, you had to say the last name for me again. Gigante would make an excellent movie. And I wonder if the premise gave the writers for The Sopranos, just a little bit of their plot.
Question. Yeah. Probably because he is, like I say, was a very colorful figure that was very, very powerful. Probably the most powerful mob guy. Some people would say John Gotti, who was one of his contemporaries after he had Paul Castellano killed, the boss of the Gambino family. Gotti was just so flamboyant and out there, but some would say that Chin Gigante was even more powerful because he didn't flaunt the power and just wasn't out there in the public eye, and so he's able actually to wield more power. And the Genovese family had, again, more assets, if you will, but more made members and associates than the Gambino family did for a time. So it's a couple of interesting characters, though.
There's a lot of really fascinating cases and work that you can do in the FBI. And I think one of the most, as far as the public is concerned, one of the most glamorous jobs in the FBI would be an agent working organized crime. So,
I was very fortunate.
Yeah. Well, you were very fortunate in many, many ways as far as your career in the FBI was concerned. Now I'm going to direct people to listen to the interview that you did on the oath, but real briefly, if you could just touch on when you joined the FBI and why you joined the FBI.
Sure. Well, I was practicing law in my hometown of Anderson, Indiana, where I'm now the president of Anderson University, my alma mater, which seems surreal. I've been here almost 5 years, but I practiced law for a couple of years in a general practice firm and just really didn't enjoy it. And after my first year of practice, I thought, I don't want to do this for the next 40 years. And so I knew of 2 FBI agents who had been lawyers who were friends of my family or the law firm where I worked. And so I talked to both of them, and they said, boy, if you're interested in change, the FBI is great. And having a law background, especially having practiced, you would be well qualified for the rules of criminal procedure and all those things. And so I thought, you know what, I'll apply and I'll see if it works out. And if not, I'll do a different type of practice or something else. And I ended up spending almost 27 years in the Bureau and got to serve in a number of different fascinating assignments and do things that I just never dreamed about. And so I have a great debt of gratitude to the men and women of the FBI who have made it such a great organization and for the opportunities I was afforded, along with my hard work, professionalism, integrity, which I encourage anybody who's interested in a career in the FBI or any federal agency to pursue those 3 qualities, and that will hold them in good stead for whatever work they're actually doing.
Well, Deputy Director of the FBI.
Yeah, I was just in, whether it's the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time, but yeah, I was very fortunate.
Was that a goal of yours?
No, absolutely not. No, that was my first 2 promotions were from New York City to FBI headquarters in DC, and then 3.5 years later on the slow plan instead of 2 years to Indianapolis as a field supervisor. Those were both motivated because my wife and I had started a family, and my in-laws lived in DC and my folks lived in Indiana, and they were getting older, and we wanted to spend time around our family. So that was my aspirations for a career, was just to have better quality time with family. And then my folks had ended up passing, and I frankly got a little bit restless and as a field supervisor. So after 5.5 years, I sought and obtained a promotion to ASAC, Assistant Special Agent in Charge in Boston, and then did that a couple of years and then got on the inspection staff. And then 9/11 happened, and then everything changed, and was invited into Counterterrorism Division, the Deputy Assistant Director. And then in short order, over the next few years, the 5 people between me and the director retired. And so it was the warm body who kept showing up, who wasn't eligible to retire. But you know what, Jerry, the joy of it was to work with such great men and women who were just dedicated to doing the right thing. And then I was fortunate. I served almost 6 years as the deputy director, which is a new indoor record. Clearly in the post-Hoover era, he had a guy, Clyde Tolson, who wasn't deputy director, but who was his, number one guy for years. And so different construct and all that. But and then if I could just add, I was fortunate to be able to go over and serve at the Transportation Security Administration, TSA. That's a Senate confirmed position. So I was nominated at that time by President Obama. I'm apolitical, and served there for 4.5 years, which is still the longest serving TSA administrator in its 18-year history. So I've been very, very fortunate. Now, I will add that I'm the 5th president of Anderson University in our 102-year history, and I'm coming on 5 years now. The first president served 39 years. I'm 63 years old, and so I have no plans to try to exceed that record. So.
Okay. So you're not. So there's really no chance. Yeah, there's no chance of you beating that record.
There is no chance. No.
But you are the record holder as far as deputy director of the FBI and TSA administrator for now, anyway.
For now, right? Okay. I'm looking forward to congratulating other people when they take those records. So yeah. Well, thanks, Jerry. Yeah.
Well, one other thing I wanted to say is that one of the reasons I was excited to have you on the show is because you will be my 190th episode.
Congratulations, Jerry. That is terrific.
Yeah. And, it has just become a mission of mine. I call it a mission because we all know what's happening in the world today, as far as people getting the wrong idea, the wrong misinformation about the FBI. And so it's become my mission. The last job I had in the FBI was the spokesperson, the media person for the Philadelphia office. And it's still deep inside me to be mindful and to want to protect the reputation of the FBI. And so this is my mission, to show people who the FBI is and what they do. And I thought to myself, if I could have the opportunity to speak to a former deputy director, that it may convince a number of agents out there who are a little hesitant of coming on the show to share their FBI journey. Yeah. Maybe it will convince them to also come on and
hopefully so
do an interview.
Yeah, that may have the reverse effect. So unintended consequence. Oh, the deputy went on, so let's not do that. Well, Part of management,
I hope not. I hope it works the other way.
I do too. Yeah.
All right. So I've kept you here long enough, but what I like to do, thank you. Oh my, yes, definitely. Thank you. Yeah. But for what I like to do at the end of the show is to make sure that my guests have said what they want to say about the FBI, about their career, whatever. I just want to make sure that in case I forgot to ask the right question, that I give you the last word. So what would you like to say?
Well, Jerry, first, thank you for the privilege of being on your show, and congratulations on having 190 episodes of this. Yeah, for me, it's been a matter of trying to discern how God was calling me in ways that I didn't intend or set out to when I was a young person, wanting to be a rich, successful lawyer, if you will. And then through a series of incidents, including an accident when I was 17, ended up broken neck, I felt like God was giving me a second chance in life, both physically, but more importantly, spiritually. And so my whole 31 and a half years of government service, between almost 27 in the FBI and 4.5 at TSA, has been about just trying to discern how I could serve, and the whole notion of public service, and how I could add value for good to others who were either fellow employees or victims of crime who really needed help. So it's been an honor and privilege to serve at the FBI and at TSA. And I just encourage any of your listeners who are considering a career to pursue those careers in public service, because there is great good to be done. And it is a great sense of satisfaction and assurance that, yes, you are doing the right thing. So that's my final word.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of John Pistole. You'll also see that photo of him doing the perp walk with Vincent the Chin Gigante. There are links to newspaper articles about John Pistole's career and about the New York mob's infiltration of the Teamsters Union. I also included a link to his interview on the podcast, The Oath with Chuck Rosenberg, in case you want to learn more about John Pistole and his FBI career. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast, and subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. This podcast is about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, I want to invite you to join my reader team, where once a month, I keep you up to date on the FBI in books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, which is a colorful list of more than 50 books about the FBI, books written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. Nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You can join on my website or use the link in the description of this episode in your podcast app. I would love it if you also check out my books. My nonfiction, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And there's also my Philadelphia FBI Corruption Squad crime series. All of my books are available wherever books are sold. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.